Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Siege of Vraks, which has just gotten a hell of a lot more interesting with the addition of Astartes forces on both sides, with the Alpha Legion under the command of Lord Arcos on the traitors' side, and Supreme Grandmaster Azrael of the Dark Angels on the, quote, loyalist side, unquote. The Dark Angels, of course, have their own objectives primarily in mind, but nevertheless, their objectives at the moment at least appear to coincide with those of the besieging army, and so they are allies of a sort. Allies that don't speak or interact with one another in any way whatsoever, but still, you know, at least they're shooting in more or less the same direction, so yay! And speaking of shooting, as mentioned in the last episode, Azrael's grand plan was to attack the Vraxian spaceport. He would then entice the enemy to send reinforcements, including the all-important traitor Space Marines, to stop them. After which, the Dark Angels would cut off their escape, surround, and annihilate them, ensuring in the process the acquisition of a few souvenirs to take home to the Rock. The first phase of this operation was already underway, with 4 companies of Dark Angels crossing the 200 kilometers from their landing zone to the southern outskirts of the Vraxian starport. The Vraxian, in return, had a general idea now of where the Dark Angels had landed. Thusly, they had sent out scouting formations to try and figure out precisely what the Astartes were up to, seeing as they were still not entirely sure of their target. The starport was certainly one of the more likely targets, but as previously mentioned, the Cardinal was not entirely sure at all that they wouldn't head straight for the Citadel. Therefore, large formations of light scouting troops were sent out into the wastelands, primarily Scout Sentinel Walkers and Salamander APCs. Once they made contact with the Astartes, the Vraxians could then figure out roughly in which direction they were traveling by noting where their scout vehicles were exploding. And after a suitably indicative number of Salamanders and Sentinel Walkers had gone boom, the Vraxians could indeed conclude that yes, the Dark Angels were most definitively heading towards the starport, and taking care of the Vraxian scouts whilst doing so. And without encountering any further mentionable resistance, the Dark Angels swiftly reached the outskirts of the Vraxian starport, with Supreme Grandmaster Azrael leading from the front in his personal Land Raider, the Angelus Imperator. And already the Dark Angels were noticing their first spot of luck. Not only had they run into considerable quantities of light scout vehicles, suggesting a already significant Vraxian presence within the starport, but observers keeping an eye on the tertiary route running between the starport and the Vraxian Citadel had already reported back large forces moving into the starport. It appeared as if the Third Company wouldn't have to wait all that long at all to close the trap, since the enemy had reacted in a rather cooperative fashion by pouring yet further troops into the starport. And considering this was the Dark Angels' primary objective, to lure as many enemy troops into it, and therefore destroy them all at once, that was a good thing. Although I'm sure already something at the back of Grandmaster Azrael's mind was starting to nag at him. The enemy was being a bit too cooperative. Rarely does a plan survive contact with the enemy, and yet this enemy not only seemed to be allowing the plan to live, they seem to be actively aiding it. But only a third-rate commander would jump at shadows, and the mere fact that the enemy seemed to be falling for the plan in the exact way anticipated was nowhere near good enough reason to cease following the plan. After all, there was nothing particularly incongruous with the idea of the enemy reinforcing one of their vulnerable positions, and even if it did turn out to be a trap, Azrael was more than confident in his Dark Angels' abilities to bust their happy little power-armored asses out of any potential snare. He thus issued the radio communique ordering the Third Company to make their move on the bridges and begin cutting off the enemy's reinforcements already within the starport. Soon, the Thunderhawks of the 3rd Company were sweeping in across the bridge, depositing their assault Space Marines on the starport side of the bridges. These were held by only a small contingent of the Vraxian Defense Force and stood absolutely no chance against the Dark Angel's assault Marines, with the majority of the Vraxians simply choosing to flee, which, in this case, probably was the wiser move. Meanwhile, the other end of the bridge was assaulted by yet further elements of the 3rd Company, forcing the enemy to retreat either onto the bridge or into the wastelands. Either way, their fate were as good as sealed. And within 5 minutes, the entirety of the causeway had been secured. Immediately, the assault marine elements began placing demolition charges along the causeway's main support pillars, utilizing their jump packs to maneuver underneath the bridge. Meanwhile, yet further tactical elements were placing demolition charges along the main roadway, as Devastator elements dug in to the southern end of the bridge, preparing to intercept any further reinforcements the Vraxians might be inclined to send. The Thunderhawks, of course, had already swooped down on the enemy's formations, scattering them and ensuring they couldn't intervene in the seizing of the bridge itself. However, it was, of course, as mentioned, not enough to merely take it. They also had to destroy it, and that was going to take a hell of a lot longer time than clearing it, as this was an absolutely massive edifice of Imperial construction work. And whilst being a mere tertiary route, it could not compare to the other 2 primary causeways, it still was a titanic piece of architecture, spanning a canyon up to 30 kilometers wide and over a kilometer deep. The roadway itself was held aloft by several monstrous support pillars, which now had to be destroyed in a controlled and ensured fashion. Undoubtedly a rather daunting task for the jetpacks carried by the Dark Angels. However, fortunately, being such a massive edifice, the Dark Angels did not necessarily have to destroy all that much. They just had to destroy the key parts keeping this grand edifice from simply collapsing beneath its own weight. Although, that's still easier said than done, since the vital parts that needed destroying were often several meters thick, and simply slapping a jetpack onto it would produce very little beyond an embarrassing smudge. And so specialist equipment had to be brought down to bore into these pieces. The jetpacks could then be placed inside of the vital supports, and they could be destroyed from the inside out. Again, however, this was going to take some time, so the Devastators, along with further tactical squads, would have to keep the Vraxians busy. What followed then was a running firefight, with the heavy elements of the Dark Angels, consisting of Devastators and tactical marines with various anti-tank weaponry, engaging the Vraxian mechanized formations at medium to long range. This might at first sound like a rather one-sided engagement. You've got tanks and APCs versus dudes on foot, but whilst you would be correct in that it was a one-sided engagement, you might be incorrect as to which side had the advantage, since the dudes on foot, the Dark Angels, had a decided upper hand. Not only were the Dark Angels veterans of many, many such engagements, they also possessed superior optics, vastly superior mobility, being able to bound and leap across the landscape on foot far more nimbly and mobile than an armored vehicle could, considering the relatively rough nature of the ground. And of course, the Dark Angel Devastators, armed with las and plasma cannons, had more than enough firepower to knock out the enemy's armored vehicles, whilst also being less than a third of the size of said armored vehicles, making them extraordinarily challenging targets to hit. Of course, there were far more Vraxian armored vehicles than there were Dark Angels Devastators, and if the Vraxians were able to dig in, line up, and barrage the enemy, they could still turn the tide of the battle, but if they did that, the Dark Angels Thunderhawks, constantly circling above, firing missiles and battle cannon shells into their formations, they would simply be annihilated. As such, the Vraxian armor had to constantly reposition, drive back and forth, and try to maneuver as best they could in the broken landscape. If they got stuck for even a moment, they were as good as dead. and under these circumstances, there was frankly precious little the Vraxians could really do to the Dark Angels. After enough time had been bought and all of the charges set, the Third Company quickly evacuated back to their Thunderhawks, who landed just long enough to retrieve the company before blasting off again, heading towards the other two bridges. The Dark Angels had decided to blow all three connecting points just to make absolutely sure that the enemy had nowhere to go, even if that direction was directly towards the first line corps of the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army. After all, if the breakthrough attempt was led by traitor legionnaires, it was far from inconceivable that they could potentially break through the Kree Guardsmen. And if they did, that would make this whole endeavour somewhat pointless, at least from the Dark Angels' point of view, so better safe than sorry. Of course, this would also mean that the Death Corps would be unable to utilise the starport until they had rebuilt the massive bridges, but hey, details. Now then, so far, the Third Company's mission had gone exactly to plan. They had engaged the surprisingly weak defenders at the bridge, annihilated them, secured the bridge, and subsequently destroyed it, at the loss of only 3 lightly injured battle brothers who would all be ready for combat at the next bridge. It had all gone absolutely swimmingly, although this too was a slight cause for concern. The Devastators did not report engaging anything that might have been traitor armor at the bridge. Traitor Space Marine armor, to be precise. Which, on the one hand, could be a good sign, suggesting that the Alpha Legion had already entered the starport, but it could also mean that perhaps Azrael was a bit too quick in cutting off the starport. But regardless, it was all much too late to worry about now, and so the Third Company, again mounted in their Thunderhawks, set off towards the next bridge. Meanwhile, Azrael's attack columns had just identified the enemy's response to his movements. Vraxian tank columns had been spotted leaving the starport, heading out into the open flats to engage his forces. This was a spectacularly bad idea on the part of the Vraxians. Azrael had originally anticipated the Vraxians digging in along the outskirts of the starport. This is why the First Company's Land Raiders and Terminator elites were in the lead of the main column. He expected the enemy to engage from the cover of the starport and attempt to deny his Dark Angels entry into the built-up areas by engaging them on the flats outside. This was due to the obvious fact that were the Astartes to enter the starport, they would have every advantage. Speed, maneuverability, protection, firepower, discipline, and sheer visceral morale-breaking impact. All of these things would be multiplied many times in favour of the Angels of Caliban if they were to make it inside of the starport. And yet, here were the enemies driving out of the only conceivable cover anywhere nearby onto the open flats with 0 air cover and virtually nothing in the way of truly effective AAA. At best, they had in their possession Hydra flak batteries, whose quad autocannons might be fairly effective against low-flying attack aircraft, but against the obscenely heavily armoured bulk of Thunderhawk strike craft, they had virtually no chance. And on the reverse side, those Thunderhawks, armed with guided missiles and las cannon batteries, had the time of their bloody lives, picking off Vraxian tanks advancing across a desolate wasteland without so much as the merest hint of cover or concealment. For all intents and purposes, it would appear that the enemy's tank commanders had all unanimously decided to commit suicide by Astartes. And when the lead elements of the Dark Angel columns finally arrived, guided in by the land speeder scouts, there was, frankly, precious little left for the Dark Angel's armoured elements to engage. The Thunderhawk had made such a thorough mess of things that all the First Company really had to do was advance straight into the starport itself. The routes that the First Company would take into the starport had already been scouted out by the land speeders of the Raven Wing, who had preceded the armoured elements to identify which routes were still passable by Dark Angel's armour, and of course figuring out roughly where the enemy was located. And every time the Ravenwing Scout identified a centre of enemy resistance, they would communicate this either to the First Company's armoured spearhead heading into the town, which would then detach Terminators or Land Raiders to flush them out, or the Scouts could call in support from the Thunderhawks still circling ahead, running a constant combat air and support patrol above the Dark Angels. They could then deploy both rockets, battle cannon shells, and bombs with pinpoint precision. Alternatively, the third option, if they discovered a particularly large concentration of enemies, was to contact the Whirlwind missile batteries located in the incoming companies, who would then blanket the area with anti-personnel or anti-armor submunitions. And since the Vraxians had already so magnificently thrown away their armored formations, there was unsurprisingly precious little the Cardinal's militia forces could do to slow down the Dark Angels, much less stop them. And as if the poor militiamen weren't already in deep enough doo-doo, night was about to set, at which point the Space Marines could also add their low-light visibility superiority to their long list of advantages. And, of course, the Space Marines don't need to stop to sleep or eat. The Dark Angels were more than capable of continuing the rapid offensive all throughout the night. And so, at the break of dawn, the Dark Angels were well and truly inside of the Vraxian starport, having claimed almost the entirety of the eastern edges and pushing several kilometers inside. Additionally, the main Dark Angels force was now located slightly to the south of the main landing pads. And to make matters even worse, the Third Company had completed their demolition work, and were now moving into the northern reaches of the starport to attack the very same landing platforms from the north, neatly catching the remainder of the defenders of said platform in a pincer movement, where they would be driven up against the anvil of the Third Company by the hammer of the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th Companies. So far, the Angels of Caliban had simply just blasted through the defenders, but now they were approaching the main landing pads, which were considerably more strongly held than the outskirts of the starport. The main landing pads had always been designed with the defense in mind, seeing as, under normal circumstances, it would be one of the most critical points on the entire planet. Of course, that had changed rather drastically along with Vrax's change in allegiance, since they could no longer count on reinforcements from the Imperium for obvious reasons. The starport was no longer anywhere near as important as it had been, but the Cardinal's forces still clearly valued it to a fair extent, and even though it was certainly undermanned compared to what it should and could have been, it was still a very heavily fortified area that rivaled the sum of the fortifications found in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd defensive lines. Unless Azrael could spirit forth a miracle from betwixt his massive armoured butt-cheeks, the Dark Angel's advance would almost certainly begin to slow at this point. And slow the advance most certainly did, although not for the reason that might be expected. The Dark Angels decided to simply not assault the landing pad during the 2nd day of the battle. Instead, Azrael contented himself with allowing his Whirlwinds and Thunderhawks to continue softening up the emplacements around the landing pad. This allowed the Cardinal's forces to consolidate their remaining troops, as well as improve and further fortify their positions, along with the various warehouses and other large storage buildings that could easily be found within the landing pad. They already had the outer defenses, now they also had a series of improvised positions within the landing pad area itself. And for the entirety of the day, the only combat actions, besides artillery strikes and bombing runs, were conducted by small combat squads, launching probing attacks against the outskirts of the landing platforms to find routes of entry for the next day. And so, after graciously giving their enemies a day to rest, recuperate, and organize, don't ask me why, the Dark Angels continued their offensive on the next dawn, with combat squads leading in formations of Vindicator assault tanks to blast out the enemy's positions. Nevertheless, the enemy's defenses, and now additional defenses in the larger buildings, proved a fairly tough nut to crack, and the Dark Angels were reduced to clearing position by position, rather than the sweeping advance of the first day. Nevertheless, the Dark Angels did make progress. Under the command of the interrogator chaplain Belphegor, they pushed south, attempting to carry out an encirclement of the main landing pads. This proved to be rather tricky, as the enemy had had enough time to reinforce and fortify their positions. They had turned practically every major building into a strongpoint, and the Astartes had to launch assault after assault after assault and clear out every single building, room by room. The Dark Angels, of course, excel in this kind of brutal close-quarters combat. Utilizing flamers, assault squads, and deck chargers, they blasted, tore, and burned their way through the buildings they deemed strategically necessary to capture. The other buildings were either completely leveled by concentrated salvos of Vindicator fire, or similarly bombed out of existence by whirlwind strikes and thunderhawks. It was brutal, but slow going, as every single position had to either be cleared or reduced one by one, and in a starport, there's a lot of buildings for a determined defender to hold up in. It would take the two companies, one under the command of the interrogator chaplain, and the other under the command of Arius, the full day and night to finally complete the encirclement. And interrogator chaplain Belphegor reported to Azrael that night that he had lost 15 battle brothers. Frankly, catastrophic casualties considering the relatively limited nature of the offensive and the fighting. In this kind of claustrophobic house-to-house urban combat, the Astartes should have every advantage. And in addition to this, the Dark Angels also had superiority in armor, air support, and artillery. And yet, 15 out of 100 battle brothers had been lost fighting against unaugmented humans. This rate of casualties could not and would not be continued. And so there was yet another break in the fighting. The fourth day was spent bombarding the remaining positions in and around the main landing pads that had now been cut off from the rest of the starport. And after these 24 hours of extra bombardment, the pocket would be squeezed from 3 different directions to prevent the enemy from concentrating their forces as they had been allowed to on the 3rd day. On the 5th day, Azrael would strike from the east. Then on the 6th, Belphegor would strike from the south, and finally on the 7th, Arius and the 3rd Company would strike from the north. This would allow each company to attack a scattered foe that would have to rush back and forth to try and meet the various forces attacking them, and then, once they had actually managed to dig in to properly resist, the focus of the attack would simply be changed to avoid the new positions. After these 3 days of continuous fighting, the pocket should then be suitably reduced to the point where Azrael could lead in the 1st Company's Terminator's elite to crush it. And immediately, this plan showed much greater promise. Now that the Vraxians could no longer concentrate all of their forces against a limited attack, the Astartes were once again able to utilize their superior mobility, attacking from multiple directions whilst also continuing to attack in all sectors with minor skirmishes. They were able to fully focus their relatively limited artillery and air forces to smash apart individual sectors one by one, and they were able to do so at a considerably lower cost in Battle Brothers. And, most importantly, finally, during the last day of preparatory assault, Lord Arius' 3rd Company made contact with traitor legionnaires. The quarry the Dark Angels had come so far to hunt had finally appeared. This revelation redoubled Azrael's resolve to lead the final assault personally. Standing up in the hatch of his Land Raider, Angelis Imperator, he led 50 members of the Deathwing Terminators into the last pocket to quash what remained of Vraxian resistance and to capture as many of the Alpha Legion traitors as possible. On the other end, the Cardinal's troops had so far performed admirably. They had been able to stand their ground and even offer a modicum of resistance against the Dark Angel's onslaught, but now, faced with half a company's worth of Deathwing Terminator elites, there was absolutely nothing they could do. They were cut down in their hundreds, whilst inflicting virtually no damage upon the Dark Angels. The most lasting damage they inflicted on Azrael and his men was temporarily immobilizing the Angelis Imperator, forcing Azrael to dismount and fight on foot. And now, with a chapter master of the Dark Angels in amongst them, the defenders' nerve finally broke. After holding their ground against the Angels of Caliban for a full 8 days, it had finally all become too much for them, and they began fleeing back towards the perceived safety of the inner landing pads, with the Dark Angels in hot pursuit. The battle for the starport had at this point lasted, as mentioned, 8 days, and I imagine that was probably longer than Azrael had actually expected, not to mention his casualties had been somewhat higher than he had almost certainly counted on. The securing of the initial bridges had cost 0 Astartes lives, resulting in mere injuries amongst a handful of battle brothers. The initial drive into the outer reaches of the starport had also been an unqualified success. The only force that could potentially have challenged them, the Vraxian armoured elements, had been so cooperative as to expose themselves to the Thunderhawk gunships and then the guns of incoming Dark Angels armoured formations. But once inside the starport, the point at which the Dark Angels should have been at their most powerful, they began suffering serious casualties, with dozens of Battle Brothers falling as the Dark Angels worked to encircle and then reduce the main landing pads. With all this in mind, it is not particularly surprising that Supreme Grandmaster Azrael looked forward to put this whole sorry business behind him, and may have pushed forward a bit too quickly, a bit too recklessly, a bit too focused on the fleeing Vraxians in front of him, because the next thing the chapter master of the Dark Angels knew was that his Terminators were taking effective fire. These were not the pitiful slug rounds of the Vraxian renegade militiamen. What they were under fire from now was hypervelocity, armor-piercing bolt rounds. The first thing Azrael knew about the ambush was when pieces of Brother Animael's spine pattered off his armor after having been blown clean through his back by a fusillade of mass-reactive bolts. Mere hours before, Brother Animael had been given the honor of carrying the chapter's sacred standard into battle, the Banner of Devastation, and with the last ounce of strength left in his body, he drove the banner pole into the ground of the Vraxian starport, ensuring that the banner itself would never touch the Vraxian dust. What ensued then was a mad dash towards the banner, the Dark Angels attempting to reclaim it, and the Alpha Legion, who had just sprung their ambush, recognizing what a massive victory it would be to nab the very banner of devastation out from beneath the Dark Angels' noses. It might seem like a lot of bother for a piece of coloured cloth, but this banner had been with the Dark Angels since the Great Heresy. If Azrael were to lose it, and Chaos Space Marines, no less, then even if they went on to win the entire war on Vraks, as long as the banner was not reclaimed, then this would no doubt go down as one of the gravest defeats in the history of the Dark Angels. Within moments, both sides were locked into a swirling melee around the banner, the Alpha Legion charging in against the Dark Angels rushing towards the banner, both sides cutting into one another with chainswords and power weapons, with Azrael leading the charge of the Dark Angels, cutting down several Alpha Legionnaires until he finally reached the banner, and lofted it up high in one hand. Moments before, a heavy blow smashed against his shoulder pad. Lord Arcos had entered the fray. Immediately, the nearest Dark Angels rushed to their chapter master's aid, but were cut down like children by a monstrous, screaming demon sword, clutched in the power-armored hands of Arcos. Their brave sacrifice, however, had bought Azrael enough time to regain his feet. Now, with the Banner of Devastation in one hand and the two-handed Sword of Secrets in the other, he was facing off squarely against Lord Arcos. Not a brilliant position, but at least he wasn't on his back anymore. And this certainly wasn't Azrael's first dance. He and the Alpha Legion Lord traded a flurry of blows in the blink of an eye, the two jostling for position in the midst of the now burning and broken starport. Neither side could come to the aid of their respective masters, as the two were moving too quickly for a clear shot, and any man, be it mortal or transhuman super soldier, that attempted to join the raging melee between the two champions were cut down in moments. Quickly recognizing the futility of intervening, the two sides busied themselves with killing one another. The Alpha Legion had started the fight from a superior position, and had cut down several Dark Angels in the opening seconds. The Vraxian militiamen had been bait, frustrating the Dark Angels' advance and luring the Dark Angels deeper into this ambush. Ironically, the loss of their sacred standard in the opening moments may very well have saved the Dark Angels from even heavier losses. When the Alpha Legion spotted this unique opportunity to so thoroughly shame their enemies, they rushed in with combat knives drawn and chainswords roaring. The swirling melee was certainly costing the Dark Angels dearly, but they would almost certainly have suffered far worse if the traitors had simply stood back and maintained their disciplined volleys of bolter-fire. Not that Azrael was feeling particularly lucky at the moment, as he didn't have much in the way of time to count his blessings. In a fair fight, Azrael would almost certainly be Arcos' equal, if not, indeed, superior, but fair fights are for suckers. And Azrael was struggling to keep the banner aloft in his left hand whilst holding off the Chaos Lord's frenzied assault with the Sword of Secrets in his right. The keening demon weapon was hammering into his guard again and again, over and over again. The venerable weapon held strong, but Azrael's strength was slowly waning, and he was being pushed back. Soon he took his first glancing wound, then a second, and a third. Then finally a powerful wild slash battered Azrael's blade aside, and before he could raise his guard again, Arcos shoulder charged Azrael, hitting him so hard his chestplate cracked on the impact, taking the chapter master clean off his feet. With a second vicious slash aimed at the Dark Angel's greaves, the demon blade bit deep, crippling the Master of Angels. Lying on the ground with a broken leg, all Azrael could do was look up at Arcos as he raised his still screaming black blade over his head, preparing to split the chapter master in half. The Alpha Legion Lord's mad grin would be the last thing Azrael would ever see, until suddenly it disappeared in a luminescent flash of a dozen rounds exploding against the Lord's chestplate. Interrogator Chaplain Belphegor, clad in his Terminator armor, stormed into the fight whilst his bodyguards provided covering fire, knocking Arcos off balance. And before he could regain it, the Chaplain's sparking Crozius Arcanum impacted upon the Chaos Lord's breastplate, shattering it and sending him flying. The Chaplain immediately turned to his wounded chapter master and ordered his escort to get him to safety. When he turned around, Arcos had vanished into the dust and ash of the burning starport. Quite the impressive disappearing act considering the situation, but then again, he was Alpha Legion, and that is more or less what they do. Along with Arcos, the rest of his legionnaires had also Batmaned their way out of the fight, and were no longer to be seen. The Dark Angels remained the masters of the battlefield, although I suspect Azrael was not particularly pleased about how this had all worked out. Again, not that he was really able to express his displeasure, as he was whisked away immediately by the chapter's apothecarian up to his battle barge in orbit. Command on the ground then fell to the commander of the Third Company, Master Orias. Naturally, he immediately set about trying to hunt down the remainder of the Alpha Legion forces, but it was soon made apparent that they had simply disappeared. although precisely how is anyone's guess. The Dark Angels had rather thoroughly cut the usual lines of travel, and yet the Alpha Legion were nowhere to be found. To be fair, it would be far from the first time the Alpha Legion have MacGuffined their asses out of danger, so I'm sure they had some secret means of transport hidden away somewhere, or maybe they just all dressed up like Dark Angels and simply just walked out. Anything's possible when it comes to the Alpha Legion. But on the bright side, with the traitor legionnaires simply choosing to up and leave, it meant that all the Dark Angels had to deal with now were the scattered remains of the Vraxian renegade militia, which they cleared up over the next 2 days. After which, the starport was fully in the Dark Angels' hands. And so they set about reducing it all to a worthless pile of junk, using detonation charges and yet more whirlwind artillery strikes. I'm sure the Krieg commanders would have had absolutely no use for this massive industrial-sized starport whatsoever, so good, wonderful. God damn fucking Dark Angels. You know. And as if to rub salt in the wound, they sent their first and only communique to the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army, directed towards the army's headquarters on Thracian Primaris. The message simply read, "By the Emperor's wrath, Vraks starport destroyed. Mission accomplished." And that was it. One has to wonder on whose side these green bastards really are, but hey, at the very least they had denied the already inoperable starport to the Vraxians, and they had killed a bunch of Vraxians in doing so, so, you know, it's something. Granted, in my more cynical moments, I suspect that the Siege Army might have preferred if the Dark Angels lent them their expertise in breaking through the ever-so-stubborn second defensive line, but hey, details. And if it might possibly provide the Krieg Guardsmen with any form of solace, at least they can take refuge in the thought that the Dark Angels didn't finish their objective either. They did not manage to capture a single traitor legionnaire alive. They did capture several renegade guardsmen, which would now be on the receiving end of Interrogator Chaplain Belphegor's hospitality, but this was certainly far from the bounty that they had wanted. The odds that one of these guardsmen would know anything about the Fallen, astronomical, and that's being optimistic. All in all, the operation was undoubtedly less than a stellar success as far as the Dark Angels were concerned. As far as the Death Court of Krieg were concerned, it was, well, not necessarily unhelpful, just not quite what they might have wanted. The destruction of the starport could prove strategically useful, with considerable emphasis on the word could there. If the enemy was going to start bringing in reinforcements from out of system, then the starport, if it was still fully operational, would be a huge boon to the Vraxians. But of course, as of this very moment, there was no real indication that the Vraxians were going to be able to do so. But hey, better safe than sorry, one supposes. On the Vraxian side of things, the arrival of the Dark Angels had scared the absolute living shit out of the upper leadership, and if it wasn't for the cool head of Lord Arcos, the very presence of the Dark Angels might have ended the siege of Vraks. As if the Cardinal had had it his way, the vast majority of the defenders of the second defensive line would have been recalled to defend the inner citadel in case of a Dark Angel invasion of said citadel. But, of course, Lord Arcos was around and that wasn't what happened, so let's try to figure out what exactly happened. The Dark Angels arrived, they attacked the starport, they took uncomfortable losses in doing so, according to the Dark Angels' own admission, and, after destroying the starport, they left. They had not succeeded in capturing any of the traitor legionnaires, which was their primary objective, but at the very least they had made the theoretical reinforcing of the traitor's position considerably more difficult. The Angels of Caliban had of course also succeeded in the destruction of a fairly considerable Vraxian armoured formation, along with the garrison of the starport. The precise strength of this garrison, however, is difficult to estimate with any degree of certainty, considering the starport is a bit of a Schrödinger starport, really. On the one hand, it should be a position of considerable strategic importance, and therefore be in possession of a fairly large garrison. On the other hand, it was also a position of virtually no strategic importance, and should therefore have a fairly small garrison. Judging by the fact that the various bridges connecting the starport to the rest of the Vraxian continent were very lightly guarded and indeed overrun in mere minutes, I would suggest that the garrison was probably relatively small. But, considering they also held up the Dark Angels for 10 full days, even though 2 of those were used for bombardment purposes, we have to assume that the garrison was at the very least large enough to man the various defences around the primary landing pads. It should also be pointed out that when the landing pads were taken out, the remainder of the starport fell in a mere 2 days, which, again, makes the whole situation even more difficult to analyse. It is possible that due to the somewhat inexplicable break in the fighting on the second day allowed the Vraxians to concentrate their forces, and therefore allowed them to offer far more effective resistance against the Dark Angels, therefore slowing down the rate at which the battle could be finished. It is possible that the battle would have been finished far earlier if the Dark Angels had continued to push their advantage. So, the size of the garrison? I really don't feel comfortable giving really any sort of an estimate. All I can really say is that the garrison was undoubtedly weaker than it could have been, but also far from the skeleton crew that it also could have been. The only real sure thing we know is that the Alpha Legion considered the battle for the starport to be lost pretty much immediately, as they contented themselves with utilizing the Vraxian traitors as bait to drag in the Dark Angels, and then they carry out a single ambush before fading back into the dust and smoke of the burning starport, indicating that they clearly didn't have any real intention to actually try and win the battle for the starport. Otherwise, in all due likelihood, they would have shown their hand far earlier and far more consistently. So, once again, at the moment at least, it would appear as if the Dark Angel intervention on Vraks had achieved very little. If they had kept the 2 bridges connecting the starport to the rest of Vraks intact and handed it over relatively intact, some battle damage included, to the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army, then it would have been a lot easier to judge, as it would have drastically improved the supply situation on Vraks. But they didn't, and so that didn't happen. On the bright side, they did kill a whole bunch of the Cardinal's men, including some traitor legionnaires, and that is most definitively worth something. And in the future, who knows, the destruction of the starport might prove to be far more important than it at first seems. And if nothing else, it had certainly improved the morale of the Death Corps of Krieg, now that the enemy weren't the only ones in possession of Astartes reinforcements, however fleeting their own Astartes reinforcements may have been. It had also apparently inspired certain members of the High Command, as in the next episode we are going to be looking at Lord Commander Julka's big push. Look forward to that one. Now, before I wrap this video up though, I need to add in a bit of an addendum here at the end. So, the lore video in and of itself is now finished, but I will be talking about a few things in this particular part of the lore. So, the Dark Angels arrived on Vraks with an objective that they explained very clearly and very early on in the book. They were coming not to help the Imperial Guard, but because they believed that a member of Arcus's warband had information as to the location of the Fallen. And it must have been some pretty damn good information for the Dark Angels to mobilize half their chapter, led by their chapter master, Azrael, as well. Clearly, whoever had whispered in their ears at this point had been rather convincing. Their primary and overriding objective then, obviously, was to capture a traitor legionnaire. This, however, seems a bit strange when you look at their plan and how they executed it. That is why I chose to interpret it in a slightly different way. I interpreted it as if the Dark Angels were attacking and thinking of cutting off the reinforcement patch at the bridges to the starport after the battle had been engaged and after they had made sure that there were Alpha Legionnaires to fight. That at least was how I explained their plan, which in the book it seemed as if that was their plan, but then Azrael attacked, and immediately, in fact before his armoured columns even reached the starport, decided to launch the attack on the bridges, cutting off the reinforcement path. I chose to interpret that in the video, as he was already convinced that there was enough traitors in the starport to be worth his while. I would consider this a bit of a creative liberty, which is why I'm making this addendum, because, as I said, when I make any logical conclusions, I usually do tell you about it. In fact, I try always to. I do think this is within what is written in the book, but I still want to point it out because there are some other inconsistencies as well. Azrael attacked the starport and then decided to call a halt to his offensive, which up until this point had been cutting straight through the Vraxian defenses, deciding instead to halt and start bombarding the enemy with very limited bombardment capabilities. The Whirlwind is an excellent artillery piece and extraordinarily flexible, but mass, long-lasting, generalized bombardment? That's just not a thing it's very good at. And for him to call a halt to a sweeping advance for a full day, giving the enemy time to not only rest, recuperate, but also to gather up, is a downright baffling decision. Once again, you must remember here, if he was trying to create an actual pocket, there would be a reason for this. He might want the enemy to move further into the pocket, but he had already cut off their means of retreat by severing the bridges. There was nowhere for the enemy to go, and so trying to lure them all into one pocket within a pocket, the only thing that would ensure was a greater degree of effective localized resistance. There's no reason for this. If anything, the Dark Angels should be seeking to cut the enemy into several smaller pockets for as long as their offensive momentum lasts. And they definitely shouldn't be calling an end to a successful offensive against an enemy that was at that point getting exhausted. Remember, again, these are normal humans. They can't fight effectively for days on end. The Astartes, they can. There was, apparently, in my opinion anyways, no reason to call a halt to the offensive at that point. And then he did it again, giving the enemy yet another day to collect themselves, to reinforce, to rearm, to rest out, when, once again, only one company had been in combat that day, or, well, two, possibly, to finish up the encirclements. It's all just really odd. Really, really odd. And then it took a full 3 days to close that one pocket as well, which, good job, Vraxians, is all I can say. They held out against the Dark Angels in a situation in which the Astartes would have, again, as I mentioned multiple times, every single advantage. Wow, no wonder the Death Corps is fucking struggling. These bastards are hard. And then there's the final odd thing. I mentioned that Azrael had brought the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th companies. Now, in the book, it seems as if he brought forces from 7 different companies, which at first I thought, like, okay, that makes sense. But Then I continued reading, and it appears as if he is using a tactical company as his primary assault force. The 6th Company is the one that was issued to Belphegor to complete the encirclement. Now, a tactical company, especially in a situation where you have access to the 1st Company's Terminator Elite, the Deathwing, and a dedicated battle company, in the case of the 3rd Company, utilizing a pure tactical company to assault heavily entrenched positions is just, again, fucking baffling. And they also mentioned that they had elements of the 8th and the 9th. Those are the dedicated assault and devastator companies of the Dark Angels, and yet apparently they weren't used in this. So again, I decided to take a piece of liberty there, assuming that he had brought the battle company. So he had brought the Deathwing Terminators, which makes sense because it's the Chapter Master, and he had also brought along the Raven Wing, which again makes sense. He had brought along half his chapter, and I was expecting to cross 200 kilometers of open ground before reaching Vraks. This was a huge deployment by chapter standards, especially against a single target. So I also reasoned he would want to bring the 3 battle companies, the 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th, for maximum flexibility, which again, of course, is what you really desperately want when fighting a battle like this. You want to have Devastators to knock out bunkers, you want to have Assault Marines to clear out fortified buildings, and of course you want the Tactical Marines for flexibility. Utilizing the 6th Company, a tactical company, therefore made up entirely of Tactical Marines, to clear out heavily entrenched enemies in an urban environment? What? I mean, it makes about as much sense as trying to level a starport using whirlwinds, so the reason why I decided to take the liberties with that is simply because I think the author was maybe not completely aware of how the Dark Angels were structured, or maybe didn't understand urban warfare, possibly? I don't know, but again, like I said, think of it what you will. It is a liberty, a small one, I would say at least, but I think it makes a hell of a lot more sense, especially considering, again, this was a force led by the Supreme Grand Master. Azrael's not a fucking noob at this. It's just, he wouldn't make mistakes like this. I just cannot imagine Azrael sending in a tactical company to clear out heavily entrenched enemy positions when he has access to the Deathwing? Not to mention the 8th and the 9th to support them. It's just, I mean, what were the Terminators doing? Were they carrying out point defense? Were they encircling the rest of the pocket? Fuck me. That would be the most epic waste of the Deathwing in the company's bloody history. Anyways, I needed to add in the addendum because when I do take these liberties, I always strive to let you know. So, now you know, think of it what you will, and until next time, I've been Arch. If you liked the video, please do consider sharing it around to friends and interested parties, and until next time, have a good day.